About 6 months ago or so, I moved into my husband's house. I didn't really notice anything at first, but after the first few months went by, I can definitely tell that something weird is going on here. One night, my husband and I got into a mini argument, and after we had both calmed down, he went to go use the restroom. While he was in the restroom, I heard someone, definitely a male voice, yelling, like very angrily, and banging on a door. My husband eventually came back in the room and he heard the banging himself, but says he didn't hear the yelling. My husband went and opened the front door to check what was going on, but no one was there, and there wasn't anyone at the back door either. Fast forward a couple months, we were in our bedroom and it was storming really bad this particular night, and all of a sudden the whole room started vibrating, and we kept hearing this weird noise come from the living room. It turns out that it was a speaker that somehow turned on, and the noise was vibrating against the wall. We don't have any idea how the speaker turned on, because it wasn't even on. Like the knob that turns it on wasn't even turned. Tonight, like not even 10 minutes ago, my husband and I got into a fight, and he left the room, and while he was gone, I heard someone banging what sounded like metal against metal right outside the bedroom window. My husband came back into the room and heard the same thing, but when he went outside to check it out, it had stopped. I've been feeling uneasy here for a while now, but all this happening makes me feel very uncomfortable. It almost seems like something is taunting me in a way. My friend comes over quite often and says that she also feels like something is off here, and the other day when she was backing out of the driveway, she saw something peeking out of the woods in her backup camera, and it somehow just disappeared. I don't know what's going on, but everything seems to happen at night, and I'm honestly trying really hard not to freak out. Does anyone have any thoughts about what it could be? Or any advice? It all began when I was about 7 years old. When I was a young girl, I was playing with my friend in my house one afternoon. We were downstairs when I heard my sister calling my name from the upstairs bathroom. This struck me as strange as I didn't think she was home. My friend also heard it, so we made our way upstairs. The voice continued to call us until we were at the top of the stairs, which is when I realized the bathroom light was off, and there was clearly no one in there. We were confused and looked around, convinced she was hiding. My sister came home hours later, as she had been out with her friend that day. I couldn't understand what had happened, and neither could my friend. We still talk about it to this day. Nearly 20 years later with nothing happening. Until 2015. In 2015, my partner and I moved into a new house to rent. It was an older house, but was decently priced and had great potential. As we couldn't afford the rent on our own, we had to advertise for a few flatmates, and before we knew it, we had filled the house with a decent group of people. My partner and I shared an ensuite bedroom, which was located on the top floor of the house. One day, I was in the bathroom doing my makeup. I had left the bathroom door ajar, which led into our room, but I had our bedroom door shut, and I enjoyed the quiet. Suddenly, I heard our closet door in the bedroom open, and a few loud footsteps against the carpet behind the open door. I figured this was my partner who must have snuck into our room without me hearing the bedroom door open. "Hi," I called out, still focusing on myself in the mirror. His voice immediately answered back. "Hi." I remember smiling and asking, "What are you doing?" To which he replied, "Nothing." For some reason, the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I can still hear the exact tone in my head. The only way I can describe it is that he was being playful or mischievous, and he was hiding something. Perhaps the way a child would answer if they were up to no good. I called back out, "No, seriously, what are you doing?" And to that, the responses stopped. My question was met with silence. When I turned around and opened the bathroom door, I realized no one had been in the room. The bedroom door was still closed, but the most peculiar, perhaps, is that the closet door was wide open, something I didn't do and I know was closed before I went to the bathroom. This startled me to my core, and I remember feeling almost sick as I spook easily. I rushed downstairs and found my partner outside on the front lawn with our flatmate. I asked him if he had just been upstairs, but they both told me they had been sitting there the whole time and were genuinely confused at my panic. My partner doesn't believe in ghosts and instantly brushed aside my story and tried to calm me down. A couple of months later, our other flatmate Matt was home alone one day making himself a cup of tea in the kitchen. He had the tea in one hand and his cell phone in the other and was walking to the lounge when he said he heard my voice. I'm Canadian and have a distinct accent in our house, whispering, "Hi Matt," right behind him. He was so startled he dropped his tea and his phone onto the ground and turned around to find no one. He swore that it was my exact voice and even said he spent a good 20 minutes trying to find me in the house after thinking it must be a prank. It was enough to scare him out of the house for the rest of the day, and when we spoke about our similar experiences, we knew there must be something more to it. Other than this, we had other weird encounters like our doors locking us out of the house, TV turning on with full volume in the middle of the night, items going missing and repeating. The usual ghost things. I no longer live in that house, but I think about that encounter sometimes and it still scares me. To this day, I wonder if those occurrences are connected or just a coincidence. I find it interesting why a spirit would mimic people. I've heard speaking to spirits gives them energy, and I wonder if this is a method as they think you're more likely to reply. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. I just woke up like a totally normal morning. Except that when I hit the living room, my parents are looking at me with a worried look. Apparently, tonight at 6 a.m. I woke up. I sleep in a second floor room that opens to a small hall, where the stairs and all the doors to the rooms are located. As my parents told me, I walked out of my room and stood in this hallway for a solid 10 minutes while muttering to myself. My parents were talking to me, thinking I was sleepwalking and trying to softly wake me up. They didn't try to wake me up more loudly because I was close to the stairs and they didn't want to risk me waking up scared and yeeting myself down the stairs. After 10 minutes, I apparently walked to a dresser room where we have a full body mirror, sat in front of it and began talking to it, as if I was arguing with someone in the mirror. Though, and this is what freaked me out the most, I wasn't speaking in my language, or any other language for that matter. I was speaking gibberish and grunting with my throat. Apparently, this happened for 5 to 10 minutes. I still wasn't responding to their attempts of waking me. But after I finished, I stood up again. I bowed to the damn mirror, went back to bed, crashed on it, and immediately started snoring. I have absolutely no recollection of any of this happening. And safe to say, my parents are unsettled to say the least. Oh, and we are taking down that bloody mirror. Nope, there might be a logical explanation for whatever the frick happened to me last night. First of all, before 2014, I had always been a hard skeptic about the paranormal. I didn't believe in ghosts or the stuff at all. But then, when I got into college, I met my now ex-girlfriend and we began a relationship. We're no longer together, so I won't tell her personal stories or details about any of this, as I don't have permission. I will, however, tell the paranormal experiences I had myself while with her. To get into context, my ex was an extremely sensitive woman. She was constantly feeling the energies on every single place she went. She could sense people's aura and feelings with almost scary accuracy. And she claimed she had been able to feel and see entities ever since she was a little girl. But of course, I always attributed it to her imagination or mere coincidence. That is, until I had my first paranormal experience. I still remember it vividly. We were at home, having a peaceful night with her best friend and watching some movies. To get a sense of my flat back then, I drew a little blueprint in order to understand the story. We were all sitting on the two sofas while watching a movie, and my ex got thirsty and went to the kitchen to get some water. In order to reach the kitchen, she would then have to walk in front of a small hallway that had connected with the rooms. A hallway with a mirror at the end of it. We didn't pay too much attention as she got up and walked to the kitchen, until she reached view of such corridor. Even at a distance, I could see how all colour drained from her face. She rammed her body against the wall and slid down to the floor while starting to hyperventilate. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. Her friend bolted from the sofa, thinking she might be feeling nauseous. And as she reached my ex, bam! All colour drained from the friend's face. I myself bolted towards her, and as soon as I reached them, I saw it. At the end of the hallway, inside the mirror, staring at us with beady, almost light-emitting eyes, there was a woman completely dressed in black, with a black fishnet shroud covering half of her face. She had no facial features other than those beady white eyes, but somehow I could feel that she was an old woman, and that she was crookedly smiling at us with a non-existent mouth. The closest description I can give is the old woman dressed in black from the movie Insidious, but with no mouth or nose, and with the eyes of the ghosts from the movie Oculus. For a couple of seconds, we stared in complete horror. All of my body was heavily reacting with goosebumps, as I recall and write how the air went completely frozen around us, and a feeling of extreme dread fell over the room. This woman, or entity, or thing, stared at us with that non-existent grin for a few seconds, and suddenly looked left and walked away, inside the mirror. She disappeared behind the edges of it, and as soon as she was gone, the feeling of massive oppression disappeared too, and we could breathe again. We stood there for minutes on end, completely frozen in fear and staring at the now empty mirror. My ex broke down in an anxiety attack and started shaking uncontrollably. Me and her friend, both skeptics until that point, looked at each other and basically described what we had seen to each other in perfect detail. It had not been a hallucination. It wasn't group hysteria. We three had seen the exact beady-eyed woman in black in the mirror in complete detail. We didn't linger. I turned on all the lights, took off the mirror from the end of the hallway, and hid it inside a wardrobe completely clad in blankets. We left the flat and slept, or tried to, in my ex's friend's house. As I said, I was not a believer until that point, and thus I had no idea about which course of action to take from there on out. I didn't contact any experts, nor did I try to clean up the flat in any way. The only thing I could do was to try not think about it too much. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination born out of being sleepy or something, but I would later discover that thing was very real, and it would pay me a visit again soon enough. I've lived my entire life without any paranormal experiences, until I turned around 20. Me and my wife live in an old military housing built in the 1930s. For the first year, we didn't notice much. My wife would tell me every day she was seeing and hearing stuff. I would just shrug it off. Well, after my daughter was born, holy shit. Maybe some of you can help me understand what some of this means. My two most solid paranormal experiences that made me believe in ghosts. First off, my daughter's room is the worst. Every time I go in there, I get an uncomfortable feeling. It gets cold in certain spots, and the general feeling in the room is off. I usually would argue with my wife because I didn't want her sleeping in there. My wife one night decides to let her sleep in there. I stayed up most of the night, hovering around the room, periodically checking on her. Well, around 45 minutes later, I get up next to my front door and I'm talking to my wife. I turned my head towards my daughter's room. A tiny animal, what looked like a cat, came running out of the room. I could even hear the little footsteps. It looked so damn real. I looked at my wife very confused because we didn't have any pets. I asked her, "Did you see what I just saw?" I then ran into my daughter's room and nothing. I checked into the hall where the animal could have ran, but both doors leading to the kitchen and bathroom were closed. Nothing. I stayed up until about 7 a.m. thinking about that, Googling into it, and never came across anything valuable. My second time happened just yesterday night. Me and my wife just got back from a camping trip. We got home really late and were getting my daughter ready for bed. We hadn't been back to our house for the weekend. It was around 2 a.m. when we got fully in bed. I was dozing off, my wife was dozing off, and my daughter was asleep. As soon as I was about to fall asleep, I hear 3 consecutive knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Not like bare hand knocks, but knuckle, high-pitched knocks. I laid there for about 5 seconds before I got up. As soon as I stood up, my wife asked me if I had heard it too. We both thought we imagined it. I thought it was someone at my front door at 2 a.m. I checked the entire outside of my house and the inside. Nothing. The next morning, I made my wife knock on different places in the house whilst I laid in the same position in bed. The window, the front door, the kitchen door, and then our bedroom door. Everything else either sounded different or too far away to hear it. It had to have been my bedroom door. Me and my wife tend not to acknowledge anything that happens in the house unless we for sure saw or heard the same thing with clarity. We aren't scared of it by any means, more or less just astonished at what's happening. I've jokingly started to name the entity Steve. My daughter is back to sleeping in our room, FYI. Aside from my 2 major events, the usual stuff I deal with I usually try to disprove, and my wife hates it. Banging on my daughter's walls, doors closing on their own, a draft in my daughter's room at all times, still haven't found why. Shadows and figures moving in my daughter's room, lights or sparks also coming from my daughter's room. My dad told me this story several times with the context of a weird, cool event that happened to him when he was 10 in the late 1970s, as if he was time traveling. As I got older though, this story has started to really terrify me, especially since I used to go into these same woods often to play growing up. His story starts off with him doing the normal thing he did sometimes as a 10-year-old boy might do, going up to the family forest to play on the outskirts. Mind you, this entire area spanned over 65 acres that we own, but overall, it spans miles. He said it was a normal day and nothing was out of the ordinary, until he got about halfway through the field towards the woods. He looked into the entryway of the woods and heard multiple men's voices coming from inside. My grandfather used to be a farmer, so my dad thought it may have been him doing something with his uncles. Being curious, as kids are, he runs over to the woods to investigate. There, he walks into the woods until he comes across an entire logging crew clearing the trees. He said it was nothing like he had ever seen before, as the men working were completely ignoring him and doing their work as if he was invisible. The other strange thing was the fact that all the logging trucks and the clothing the men were wearing looked extremely outdated. Now that he thinks back to it, he says it was at least by 30 years or more behind. He starts walking through the area and trying to ask the men where they came from and who they were. One man finally notices my dad, squats down to him and says, "What are you doing here, kid? You need to go back home." My dad, very confused, agrees to follow the man back to the edge of the woods. They wave goodbye and my dad starts walking back home. He says all he can remember after that is starting to walk back, but walking up in the middle of the field and the sun was now setting. He'd been gone for nearly 2 hours, according to his mom, which she had been yelling and calling for him for hours to get back inside before dark. And she was getting really worried, as he only normally stayed gone playing up there for only about an hour tops normally. The weird thing was, he said it only felt like he was gone for about 15 minutes tops. He also never took naps or fell asleep outside like that, and it never happened since. For some reason, he never felt the need to bring up what he saw to my grandmother. I still don't understand why he never did, and he to this day doesn't really know why he didn't either. He said when he got home, it was like he couldn't really speak at all, and he was incredibly drained. As the next few days went by, he told himself that it was probably real, and that his dad probably hired people to clear out the woods for lumber selling. He said things got really weird when he went back the following week, and it was as if the men were never there at all. The trees weren't cut, no tire marks, nothing. Still didn't bring it up to his folks for some unknown reason. Years later, as an adult in his 30s, he sat down with my grandfather one day over lunch, and somehow getting on the topic, my dad wanted to ask him a few questions. By this point, my dad was convinced he either had a very weird dream and really did pass out, or he had travelled back in time. To be honest, up to this point, he really did think of it as a possible strange dream, until my grandfather answered a few of his questions. He asked my grandfather questions about the property itself, how many times it had been logged, among other things involving logging. He said the biggest thing that stuck out was that my grandfather told him that about 30 or 40 years before my dad was born, his family had hired a logging company to come clear the area to sell lumber. Nothing super eventful about it, but it matched the time period of everything he saw perfectly. Thinking back to my own childhood, there were so many times that I went exploring by myself or with my dogs in those same woods. The strangest things I could ever think that happened to me was that I would occasionally hear men yelling construction talk, but I always just thought it was our neighbours on the outskirts of the forest. It sort of sends a chill up my spine thinking about it now. I also found barbed wire fences meshed into the trees, horseshoes, and old tools from where it used to be farmland, as well as interestingly shaped natural streams, which weirdly enough do look like stairs, lol. There's tons of natural cave systems on our property as well, which I've managed to find one where one of the streams flows into underground. It's a really cool forest and quite beautiful, but there are some really creepy areas that are just completely empty of any plant life, including weeds, even though it's been untouched for decades. When I was about 8 or 9, can't remember the exact age, I visited my relatives' apartment with my mom. My father brought me a cute doll from overseas, and I wanted to show it to everyone in the household. While my mom was talking to the relatives, I decided to visit their neighbour's apartment. I knew them well, and I'd been to their place many times. I went to that flat, greeted some family members sitting in the living room. I then took the stairs to go to the upper floor. I remember the upper floor was dark and the only light was coming from the veranda. I saw 2 family members sitting and talking. I went to them, showed them my doll, and walked back to the dark hallway to reach to the stairs that would take me back to the first floor. That's when I saw a woman who walked into the room at the back of the hallway. From the back, she looked so much like one of the women who lived in the flat. I thought of following her into the room as I wanted to show her my doll. Before I did that, I became very scared for some reason. Part of the reason may be because the room was pitch black, and I was confused why she wouldn't turn on the light. I was worried she might hide in the corner trying to jump at me in the dark, so I decided not to go into the room and went downstairs, only to find that woman in the kitchen on the first floor. I didn't see her on my way in, but she had been downstairs all along. I told her what I saw upstairs, and she exchanged a funny look with another family member there and just brushed me off. By the way, there were no guests in the house. I don't know who I saw. I told my mom about it later too. She also brushed it off, but I later overheard her talking to my dad about some funny things going on in the apartment after they brought in a harp-like musical instrument. My mom said they would hear someone playing the harp at night, and when they checked, the sound would stop. I've been intrigued by mimic stories, especially because of this childhood experience. This is the one and only encounter I have with anything paranormal. From where I come from, there are beliefs and warnings about mimics. For example, hikers and hunters are told not to call each other by their real names, as mimics can lure them to make them lost by calling their names in the voice of someone they know. They could also trick you by looking like your friends and make you follow them. Last night, I had a really weird experience. I was laying down ready to fall asleep, but fully awake still, and my boyfriend turned on the sound noise machine so he could fall asleep. He always does it, and it never bothered me before. However, not too long after he turned the machine on, I started hearing a sequence of individual tunes that became a melody, a sound that starts and stops. First, I thought that he had changed the machine itself or the sound coming from the machine. I asked him if he could hear music coming out of the machine, and he said no. He asked me how it sounded like, and he couldn't hear it still. Then he changed the sound, and I stopped hearing the first melody. And a few minutes later, I started hearing a new melody. I asked him again, and he said he couldn't hear anything, but I was hearing something completely different. And this time it sounded almost like a symphony, but with very few instruments. Then he turned off on the machine a couple times, and finally he told me he could hear something. He said he could hear small pitches when the machine was on, but it was totally different from what I was hearing, as this was the third melody I was hearing. He then turned off the machine, and I thought I could finally sleep. However, a few minutes later, I could still hear another different melody, so I just gave up fighting and went straight to sleep. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and still hearing some sort of melody. All the sounds I heard were clear. It seemed like someone was playing outside, and I could hear through the bedroom window. I don't know what else to say to explain myself a little better. By the way, I'm 23, female. I lived in many old, creepy houses. One in particular was the worst by far. There was so much demonic activity in that house, which terrified me because I knew about it. My gifts were developing at the time, and I could see and feel it. Not to mention the predisposition the house had to it, considering the abuse and misery that pooled there between my shitty family and just being an old house. The area itself was known for paranormal activities, and the mountains surrounding were the origin of countless urban legends. Anyway, I'm laying in bed right now, unable to sleep until I get this off my chest. It fills me with such a heavy anguish every time I think about it, and I just need to get it out. My bedroom was on the second floor. We had an attic we never used and very creaky floors and stairs. During the summer, when everyone was home all the time and our most negative energies were rampant, is when it started. There were precursors to it, but this was absolutely terrifying. I would go to bed around midnight. Every morning, without fail, I would wake up at around 2:50 a.m. I would hear slow footsteps creaking in the kitchen, go into the living room, up the stairs, and right outside my closed bedroom door. I always slept with my dog, and she would bark and scratch and growl at whatever stood outside my door at 3 a.m. It would stand there for a while, then climb into the attic and walk around slowly. It knew I was scared. It wanted me to be afraid of it. I always put salt at my door and windows because I knew certain entities would notice me once my gifts started developing. I knew it couldn't come in because of that, but I wonder what I would have seen and what would have happened had I opened that door to look at it. I'm happy I didn't, and I never want to find out. This was when I was in 5th grade. I went with my best friend to her cousin's house for the day. They had a Ouija board that they wanted to play with. This was my first time even seeing one, so I didn't really know what to think. Nothing was scary. We sat around the board, asked questions for the spirits, laughed at how stupid it was and how boring it got real quick. I don't recall us saying goodbye or doing anything you're supposed to do when taking these boards seriously. One of the cousins felt uneasy, so we all gave up the game and went outside to play in the sprinkler, lol, naturally. We come back into the house to eat. A cousin went into his bedroom where the board and planchets were left lying on the floor and found the board face up on the ceiling, as if someone had glued it there. They had bunk beds, so one of them climbed to the top bunk with a broom and tried scraping it off the ceiling, but it wouldn't budge. I don't remember anyone being scared or relating this to something paranormal. Honestly, at that time, I had no idea what that word meant or what it would look like. We all thought it was weird as fuck, don't get me wrong, but no one felt scared. After failing to get the board off the ceiling, he gave up and we searched the room for the planchets, finding nothing. We just went on with the day, leaving the room with the Ouija board stuck to the ceiling. The board did fall off on its own in the middle of the night, but the planchet was never found. My friend and I left and I went home that evening without a care in the world. This night, I was laying in bed about to go to sleep, but I was startled by the image projected onto the back of my eyelids whenever I would close them. Very simple. Black periphery, in the middle looks like an open doorway with white light shining through. But in that doorway stand two men, one about a foot taller than the other, but both were just solid black human figures with top hats. I know, first thing you'll think is Hat Man, and maybe it was, but I'm not so sure. Every single time I closed my eyes, I would see them. I wasn't scared per se, more intrigued. It's like when you look at the sun for too long, then close your eyes, you can see all those coloured specks. Except I was looking into the pitch black, then closing my eyes and seeing the same non-blurry image on my eyelids. Details about my young years. Raised by a single alcoholic mom, so beside taking care of my brother, I was alone most of the time. I put that in quotes because, yes, I had friends, but my mind was much more developed and different than everyone else. I was alone in my thinking. We were very poor, so no TV. For indoor fun, I would study the rip-off flashcards that would come with my National Geographic magazines. The night in question, before laying in bed, I learned the alphabet backward, then read some Moby Dick. I was that kid. End of rant, back to story. So I just kept opening then closing my eyelids to see if the image would go away. I thought maybe my eyes were strained from either writing the alphabet backwards so much or reading with a flashlight under my sheets. I wasn't scared, but wondered if I should have been. I remembered thinking, well, this is the way it is now. I'll have to get used to it, and fell asleep. The next day, I woke up like nothing, went to school, had a normal day, but bedtime came, and it wasn't until I closed my eyes and saw the two men on my eyelids that I remembered the night before. This night I was more annoyed. Questions ran through my head. Does everyone see something when they try to sleep? Or are they there when I blink too? Again, I just kind of welcomed the new part of growing up I was annoyed with. This started in 5th grade and lasted until 6th grade because I specifically remember going to bed one night and not seeing anything and thinking, wow, it's over. I thought it'd last forever. It wasn't until middle school years when I became fascinated with the paranormal that I remembered this and thought it was definitely not normal. I always like to discount all options before concluding paranormal activity, but it irks me more than the event with the Ouija board happened the same day it started. Maybe something was trying to attach to me but couldn't. Maybe because I was more intrigued, annoyed than scared. This isn't the only glimpse I had into otherworldly happenings though. Before the Ouija board, I experienced things in the wood. Later in life, I encountered domestic entities for the first time. In 1999, I was 7 years old, playing in the woods with my friend Charlotte. We were standing at each end of a big log in the woods when I noticed movement in my peripherals. I tried focusing my periphery to catch a detailed look. I see similar movement often when we're in the woods and always disappears, more like scatters, before I turn to look. My heart skipped a beat when I could make out a group of little people looking up at me as well. I was frozen in the pose I was playing in. After a few seconds, I realized Charlotte had stopped narrating our play and was frozen in place as well, staring at me but focusing on them. I'm pretty sure they were dressed because it didn't look like they were all naked. I could tell they knew we were aware of them, and they dispersed as Charlotte moved her eyes. We didn't talk about it until we were in her house. We weren't afraid, just confused on our walk home. We wrote about what we saw before talking about it to see if we saw the same thing. Unfortunately, both our descriptions were so vague, but clothed less than a foot for sure. One thing we were positive was to our mind, our business and not to go searching, which is what our instinct would have usually been. Duh. We thought we found a colony of little people in the woods, but the fact that our reaction was to quietly leave and not even talk about it until behind closed doors, and still not even talk out loud but write it, I don't remember being too frightened. In fact, we kind of just accepted it and moved on with a new taste of what this world universe is capable of. I watched The Indian in the Cupboard later in life, which reminded me of those little people. But I no longer saw them by then. Charlotte and I would talk about seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, but could never figure out what it was. Although Charlotte was different. Her and her dad were huge hippies, tire swing in the kitchen, no TV, and her imagination was so wildly magnificent that it made my mind radiate. I always thought that maybe her narration of our play was so powerful and energetic that we could manifest and see the same thing. Little people were never playing any parts in either of our imaginations. In fact, when we both confirmed what each other saw, we were kind of in awe that we've never seen dreamt of tiny people in this universe. I'm currently reading through all my old diaries, aged 11 to 22, and came across the night in question. It was in the middle of an entry. For a second, I didn't even know I was reading the same event that touched me so deeply. For context, when I was 12, my mom couldn't find a sitter for a late night meeting, so I had to go with her, along with my younger brother, B, and a friend, Mac. We had to keep ourselves entertained, somehow, in the church at night. Naturally, there's a cemetery in the back we had to fool around in. Me, Mac, and B went into the cemetery in the dark. I screamed and hid behind a gravestone to scare B. Then B taught us a ritual that brings the spirits out. You stand on a gravestone and say, "May you raise," 10 times. I stood on about 6 stones at different times and did it. Then I was standing on one and Mac and B were facing me. Mac saw something walk towards us and then run. I saw a black something that was hunched over, going behind a tree. B saw what I saw. Then we were up near the church, more, and I was staring at one that was right next to a tree. I stared at it for a long time, and it was shaking a lot and fast. Its head moved the most. Then it waved for me to go over there. I'm not crazy. Mac even saw it too. To clear things up, Max saw something walk towards us and then run. I'm standing on a stone, facing B, Mac, the church, and a wooded area to the right of it, where I saw the something. Max said he saw a tall, robbed person standing behind a stone in the back of the cemetery. While she was trying to make out what she was seeing, it appeared a few rows closer. She screams and pulls me off the grave. Fallen on my stomach, I look up to see her and B running towards the church spotlight, so I followed. I was computing what I thought was a hunched, robed person walking behind a tree within the woods next to the church. At the same time, they were absorbed in the figure behind me. Our descriptions of the two different things we saw were oddly similar, though theirs sounded tall, around 7 foot, and mine was short, around 5 foot. I also was to point out that I completely forgot about the part where we stood under the light and stared at one of them next to a tree. All three of us stood there in silence for at least 5 minutes. I remember watching its head rotating around the shoulders like a pinwheel, so fast it was blurry. Following this experience, I don't recall feeling anything about it. Even my diary entry quickly moves into another topic. It wasn't until a couple years later when I experienced a similar entity in a cemetery while using a Ouija board with a friend. I felt a dreadful, familiar feeling, one that made me recall the night at the church. On the outside, my skin felt sweat, like I suddenly got the flu. But on the inside, I'm a dark, hollow carcass, bound to the savageries of the universe. While we were working on the house before we moved in, me and my boyfriend both felt very uneasy alone at night, and during the day, I wouldn't step foot in there without my dog. Also, the house across the street is haunted. Not sure there's any correlation. We've been here for about a year. Our first night, I saw something in my dining room with white long hair totally glitch out, like mouth open, convulsing, head back and forth. Super fast, I don't know. I just went to bed because I was trying to convince myself it was just me. I seem to be able to sense and see energies, I guess. My daughter is 2 and told me people are in her room. She's become afraid of the dark and she screams bloody murder about something under my bed. More than 5 times when I was alone, the electricity cuts out and back on for a minute at a time. It will go on for 10 or so minutes, and my dog will bark and growl so aggressively down the pitch black hallway. There's no outside door, it only leads to bedrooms. It scares the absolute shit out of me. My boyfriend has seen 2 old ladies looking at him through the doorway while he's sleeping. You feel the negative energy in here, it's very heavy. But there are more concerning things that happened, which makes me feel very uneasy. My daughter started screaming in the middle of the night. I got up to go down the hallway to her, but I was stricken by pure fear to the point I was trembling, trying to make it to her. I felt like something was holding me back or making it hard for me to get to her. The back of our house is miles of woods. There's no reason for someone to be back there, but I'll see a flashlight go on for maybe a minute. I'm staring at it, it shuts off and moves 30 feet, turns back on about 5 times. I see this, send my boyfriend out to go looking with the dog, and he sees nothing. This happened on 3 different occasions. I'm the only human who can see the light, apparently. I'll sit outside at night to smoke and hear a woman talking in the woods. I run in to get him, and as soon as he comes out, she stops talking. The same with an animal crying. My boyfriend can't hear it, and as soon as he comes out, it stops. But I know it can't be crazy because the dogs also hear it. Finally, one night while we were in bed, I was asleep and didn't experience this. My daughter came in the room at night and started talking to my boyfriend, just rambling. He can't remember what she was saying, and all of a sudden, he got this feeling and yelled, "You're not," my daughter's name, and this entity disappeared. So now I have something in here that is able to make itself look and act like my child. I got so freaked out, my boyfriend called this guy. He's Spanish and he gave me something I never even got the name. It's in this plastic wrap. It looks like a cube of sugar, maybe with a strong smell. You throw it in a vase with water and it turns blue, and I put it in my daughter's room. It offers her protection. It's been a couple months and nothing significant has happened, except I can still feel it at night, like I'm not alone, and I get this random feeling of just dread. And I still hear shit outside at night. I know there's something here, so I just don't know where to start or how to get rid of it. I have 2 different family members who saw something which I believe is similar, though it might not be, around 30 years apart, and I'm having a very hard time finding anything that fits the description of the one sighting. Around 2005, my brother would have been 6 or 7. He says he was walking up our steps to go to bed and saw a small elf-like creature dart down the hallway into another bedroom. It was around 2 feet tall. I can't remember exactly if the colour of his clothes were green or brown, but he said it had a long, thin, almost pointy hat on. In the late 70s, my uncle and father were kids laying in different bedrooms, and they heard walking up and down the stairs 3 different times. Finally, my uncle got up and looked into the hallway, and there was a shadow he thinks maybe around 2 or 3 feet tall at the top of the steps, but it was holding what he describes as a burlap bag or something in his hands. It reminds him of a leprechaun holding a bag of gold. When he explains it though, the figure was just a shadow. He says he ran basically right through it to my father's room and jumped in his bed. While running, he looked back quickly and saw the thing run down the stairs. I'm really interested in looking into these sightings and what they could be, but I'm having trouble finding anything good. I did read that these sightings are common in the Philippines and Ireland. Our father's side of the family are both Philippine and Irish, so I wondered if there was any correlation there. Also, I'm wondering exactly what these things are, that there could have been, or why they might be there.